Okay, so we're going to be learning a short Maamar. Not sure we're going to have a class tomorrow, but we will have a class Friday. So if you have this, we're going to bring up the text. It's a short Maamar on this week's parsha, which deals with the laws of purity for the Kohen. That who is a Kohen allowed to become impure for, and this connection to this idea to in the Hasidic ideas. Hopefully we can try to bring some pages up here. Okay. So the pasuk says like this. Somewhat the Kohen, who is the Kohen allowed to or should become impure for, meaning going to a funeral, etc., for loved ones, for close family members. So the Torah says, HaBesulah hakroiva, to his sister, the virgin who's close to him, Elav, asher loy hoysel ish, on condition she hasn't yet been married, la yitmא, for her you should become impure. It means we cover that the Torah is telling us that the Kohen is allowed to become impure to go to the burial of a sister. The Torah describes her a sister, a virgin who's close to him, who's not been married to her. La yitmã, the Gemara, of course, says he's obligated. The Zohar teaches. In Hispar B'Kamadrushim, and this Zohar is explained in many different Hasidic discourses. And one of the discourses is the Maamar starting with the verse of HaBesulah from the year Taf Reish Kaf Tes, which would be 1869, which V'divrei Maskazev V'bichu Maamari Admar Tzemach Tzedek. And this is also found in one of the books of the teachings of the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe Chabad, Sheniftale Mizman, that got out of Russia. The Rebbe is saying the Sikha in 1964, so close to 100 years. This from Maamar was said before, and that book, the book that had the manuscripts of the Chassidus, was held back in Russia, and it got out. So the Rebbe calls it Shenifta, it was redeemed. Loy Mizman, recently, Epidyon Shavuon, in like redeeming those captives. The Rebbe basically says we're going to explain the Maamar of the Tzemach Tzedek that we just got out now. The Rebbe had accustomed those years, that's foreign, that were coming out from the Rebbes that had Maamarim that weren't in print. These were Maamarim which were kind of redeemed, so to say, where they weren't, no one had access to the content. So the Rebbe, a lot of the times on the Shabbosim around these years, would talk about one of these discourses on the Shabbos, to explain it and kind of say it over to as a way of celebrating its release. So this Maamar that we're learning now from the 20th of Iyar, from the year 1964, Tavshin Chavdal, is one of these Maamar, based on a Maamar of the Tzemach Tzedek from the year Taf Reish Chavtes, which is 1869. So what does the Zohar say? Back to the content. Reb Abba Pasach, Reb Abba said that's how we say, we know that's how the Zohar starts. Pasach is opened up to discuss an idea. Mizeh, also the Rebbe explains Pasach through saying something in the Zohar and opened up the valves, opened up the gateways for the flow from these ideas from the Zohar. Mizeh, quoting on the Pasuk of Yeshaya Hanavi. So let's just bring up the Psukim over here a little let's just bring up the Psukim for a second. So the Psukim are as follows. The chapter 63 of Yeshaya starts with the famous verse, the Rebbe spoke about this many times, about the days of Mashiach. So in the description of the days of Mashiach, Yeshaya says, Mizeh ba me'edem, chometz begadim mibatra. And the combination, really what we're holding now, Edom represents Western civilization, Batra is Iraq, Iran. So the pasuk says, who's coming from Edom with surah garments from Batra? Zehadur belvushe tzoye berev koichani medaber b'tzedakah rab lo hishia. So with greatness and strength through the salvation of tzedakah. Okay, then we have Pesukim that we're going to have to get back to as the Rebbe continues the Maamar. The Rebbe is going to be he's going to be quoting different verses from this chapter, from this prophecy of Yeshaya Navi. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the verse that says, Pura derachti levadi, a winepress I trod alone, mi amim ein ish iti, and from the people None was with me, ve'edrachem ba'api, and I trod on them with my raft, v'ramseim b'chamosi, and I trampled on them with my fury. V'yez nitzcham, this is an important verse that we're going to see in a second, and their life blood, from the word like zon, you spritz blood, it was called hazaya in the Torah. Nitzcham really means from the word netzach, strength, but in this case the netzach is referring to the blood, because the blood is the strength of the person. Al begodai b'chol malbushei egolti. So, and their life blood sprinkled on my garments, and all my clothing are soiled. And galti also could be similar letters from the word geula, redemption, but also the word magil, disgusting, which is that the clothing are soiled because of disgusting. This verse is what we're going to be focusing on. So the pasuk, so back to the Maamar. The Zohar says, Ravam pasach, Rav said, who's this coming from Edom? From Rome, and what Rome represents. Chametz begadim, the glow, your chametz from the word from is soiled. Your clothing from Batra, which is in Iraq. The Maamar explains what's this pasuk talking about. Mizay bami Edom is talking about where Hashem's going to come redeem the Jewish people. Migolis Haravi, not just of any redemption, but this fourth redemption, Golis Edom, from the exile of Edom, of Rome. The Zohar says that then Hashem is going to enclothe himself in garments of revenge against Edom and everything Edom did to the Jews over the 2,000 years of the Galus of Edom. Until the clothing are going to be soiled, and that's why it says, like I said in the verse at the end, my clothing are magil, the galti is disgusting, or soiled. Why would he do this? Why is Hashem going to enclothe himself in the clothing of vengeance and fight with Edom until his clothing are soiled? Means he's ready to get dirty, literally speaking. For what? Why would he do this? For his sister, the virgin, which is of course referring to the Jewish people. Yitmah, he's ready to make himself impure. He's ready to get into places of uncomfortable places that Hashem doesn't want to be, tamei, on behalf of the Jewish people. Begina lakamalo, so he could go down and lift her up, so to say, the Jewish people, to lift them up out of Galus. So this is what the Zohar says. On the pasuk, but to reference, the Zohar says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu days of Mashiach. It's referring to Hashem. Hashem is the Kohen, that for his sister, the virgin who's close to him, who wasn't to another person. We're going to see at the end of the Maamar how beautifully each one of these descriptions is a compliment to the Jewish people. How notwithstanding of the Galus, and notwithstanding that Hashem has to soil himself to get us out, but essentially we're close to Hashem, we stayed loyal to Hashem. And then he's ready to do that. Why? Because we're his sister, the virgin, his sister. We never went to a person, Ish Acher, we weren't with any other person, obviously, representing the sides of the places of evil. Although we're in the mud and we're tamei, but we're tamei staying in a situation of purity, of dedication, and so to say, commitment to Hashem, notwithstanding if we're not perfect. That's the idea of the Zohar. So the Rebbe explains, to understand this, we first need to understand how you do this idea. Okay, so first we have to describe what is this dirty place, the place that God has to be yitmah, lo yitmah, he's ready to make himself impure, he gets his clothing soiled, a galti from the word magil, he's literally spritzing blood. What's this energy that he's confronting? He's confronting Edom. What does it mean, confronting Edom? What is Edom? What does it mean? Anything that exists has to come from Hashem. So obviously, we know the rule is that anything exists is siphoning off Kedusha, because everything has to have a source in holiness. So if there's impurities are taking energy off Yinika. It's called siphoning off the energies of Kedusha, which are vulnerable traditionally. So the idea usually is that the midos of Hashem, as we explained, let's say chesed, kindness, if it's not 100% protected from all sides, Kindness could have bad outcomes, or gvura, too many boundaries could have bad outcomes. So the midos are a direction of how one directs their emotions, right? But like just in a person could be very loving, but that loving could be given off the wrong impression and could be damaging. So in the midos, seemingly, the midos are the sources where there's a unique asachitzayim. So in those damaging or situations that are not explained or expressed properly leads for opening for unique asachitzayim. So the Rebbe says, number one is the actual sphira themselves. They're not siphoning off the sphira itself. Is the attribute stays holy. They're not taking that it's actually a negative side of chesed of Hashem. And therefore, that we mean to say, what does it mean to siphon off the life? If it's taking from the actual midah means that there's something that's connected to the impurities or the negative, that there's a negative of God's chesed. You can't say that God's chesed is all holy and good. So what are they siphoning off? You can't say that the actual lights and vessels themselves have anything to give, so to say, life to the negative. But it says it's siphoning off the midos, off the sphere. So what's it mean? It's how you enclothe yourself. Like a person, right? The message, my father used to tell the famous story of the soldier who meets the czar and took a swim and he was naked and stands in front of the king. The king says, "Where's your uniform?" He says, "Who serves you, me or my clothing?" So although that works maybe one or two times, the czar wants to see you in your uniform, but the uniform represents in a more distant manner, so to say, the garments represent the more distant manner, the essence, the thing that's enclosed in it. So the actual midah itself, the attribute is all holy, the vessel and the light. But it encloses itself means it manifests itself. What's clothing? Clothing is a method of communication. You can't just stand naked in front of people. So you have to clothe yourself. And for instance, when you want to go to a certain meeting, right? So you dress up for the meeting, you dress up for the event, you dress up for the simcha, you dress up for a date. Now, after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, one will understand if the clothing really represents something or not. A person can put on a beautiful suit, look very sharp and very intimidating, and a really, the professional lawyer, and then opens his mouth or her mouth and they sound like an idiot. So the clothing are only going to tell us so much. There's no real essential connection between the clothing and what's being enclosed in it. But in a healthy manner, a person is trying to represent something about themselves in their clothing, that through the clothing, it's a method of communication. So to the midos, it clothes itself, means how it kind of manifests itself in the world. And there, in the clothing, but like in clothing in a person, could be misrepresented, it could misrepresent what's enclosed. So to over here, the clothing could be a source of siphoning off, but there's a negative source coming out, some sort of connection to the message in the clothing. But the message could be taken wrong, and that could give a life force towards chitzanis. Means to say, it's not 100% like a good example of a suit, because a suit actually means nothing. But it's the message of the suit. So imagine the suit had a life of its own, trying to present that message that the suit means. That's the garments that we're saying. It's not like if it was just a little garment that had no chayis in it, so there's nothing to siphon off. How could you siphon off? But there's a message that when a person's wearing that clothing, the message that's coming through in that moment of how you're representing yourself, that you could siphon off. So if chesed encloses itself, and so over there, the message isn't 100% guarded, so there's a space for that message to be, it could be corrupted or to be manipulated. Not even in the inner garments. But the external garments, because we know garments themselves, there's undergarments, there's close garments, there's garments that are even more external. You have actual clothing, you have a jacket on top of a coat on top, and they have different purposes. So over there again, it's all part of a communication, but the more distant it is, it has a life force, it has a message, it gives off some sort of chayis that can be manipulated by the forces of impurity. Okay. But nevertheless, you understand, if you're in front, you want to say that the garments themselves are the source of unique chitzanim, the siphoning off of the negative energies. At the end of the day, the pasuk says that God says, which is meaning my clothing, my covet, I don't give to anyone else. That the clothing are protected. La'achar means to negative. And I don't give. So how could we say that in the kavod, which represents the clothing, is is this, that's a source of negativity. Clothing are called covet. How do we know? That he called his overcoat by covet. Why? Because again, there's a certain message that your clothing give about who you are. So it's if a person walks in looking sharp or looking well dressed, so then the clothing will bring covet to the person. People say, "Oh, this person's important," etc. So he gives some sort of covet, but Hashem says, not even to the covet he doesn't give. So how can he say you're siphoning off the garments? Therefore, it's understood. How could the garments? How could the negative forces be siphoning a life off the garments? Again, each garment represents another midah, another attribute. So the Rebbe explains. The idea is like this. Again, you have. If you're on a beginner's level and listening to this, so you have to just really apply this to a person where there's a lot of mixed messages or misrepresentation or bad communication that is not really representing the person. It is and it isn't. It is because the fact is you've said it, or you communicated it, or you dressed this way, or you acted this way, and it could not be a real representation of what's going on inside you, but there is obviously something broken if that's the message you're giving off. If you're giving off the wrong message, whether intentionally or not, that message has a life to it. You may not see it, like, what's the big deal? Did I say anything just because I walked in my pajamas? But that message has a life to it. So imagine anything that exists as chayus, even a message, even a communication, and that could give off the wrong impression that could cause corruption, that could cause siphoning, that could cause damage. The Rebbe says the idea is like this. You're right, it's not all garments. It's the garments of the attribute of kindness. Why? Why the attribute of kindness is the source of negative? Because the energy of chesed is the whole character of the attribute of giving, chesed of kindness and giving, is unlimited giving and kindness. It's a hashpa, a flow. By definition, gvur is the total opposite. Very reserved, very guarded, very protected, boundaries. Chesed is a huge, tremendous flow of giving. And a giving person or in a giving situation, when it's in an abundance, there could be a lot of, let's give an example. In COVID, there was all these programs that were helping people in COVID. At the time, it was in abundance. Anyone who signed up got monies, and then only later did they start going through the paperwork and say, this person say the truth, is this business really needing that much? Did they need that much? How they use the money? Did they just use it for themselves, or did they use it for the business? I mean, at the time, no one asked any questions, because that was just chesed of giving. Flow of we need to flood the market with resources so people could keep their businesses open and pay their salaries. Afterwards, there was accountability. But at the moment of the giving, and therefore what happened, there was a lot of corruption. People that wanted to take what they didn't need. The same thing over here. He's saying the chesed is at its source, it has no limit in its giving. So then it can give also to negative people, to negative sources as well. And they don't have to really dress up so nicely. They could be also, it's so unlimited in giving that it'll give consciously to negative forces, because it's not giving, it doesn't have any math. When the math kicks in, that's the need of gvura. That's the attribute of gvura is coming, saying, 1 second, where's the accountability for this flow? And so when it's the garments of that, it's such a flow of giving, that though in the actual midah itself, it would only give to something holy, it doesn't want to be connected to anything that's separate from God. Because you have to remember something. There's one fundamental rule over here. Everything godly is batal. Means anything that's connected to God is totally nullified to God. The fact that there can be existence of something that's nifra, that's separate, that's a chiddush. God allowed in creation that there should be something that's separate. But if something that's getting from the midah, it has to be connected to Hashem, because the God is one. Hashem echad, and Hashem is, everything is one about Hashem. It's not like the bittul is an avodah only because you're a nifra, but the closer you are to God, it's not even an avodah, because yitaka don't exist. It's only an impression that you think that you exist. But in chesed itself, there's no space. But in the garments, it's expressed So then the negative could get discipling. Where do we find this? Avram was the quintessential giver. Although when he gave, traditionally he had his limitations. He said, I'll give you food. You have to say thank you to God. Not I'm going to charge you. So he wasn't just out of control, but there was elements of Avram that didn't have the boundaries. For instance, he says, let Yishmael be your son. Why do you? I don't need you. Yishmael will become my son. God said, no, that's not what the plan was. Yishmael will have his things, he'll have his blessings, he'll have his dynasty, as we know Yishmael does have, but that's not the Kavanah. The Kavanah was Yitzchak. And of Yitzchak, it was Yaakov. Behind him, but why would he want to give Yishmael? Is because Avram is chesed, so therefore Yishmael is not a contradiction, because he's all about giving. And that kind of mindset of just constantly giving into everywhere allows for corruption and mismanagement and siphoning, etc. And the klipos are not just taking and saying we don't want to give. They fight. They're menagid. Menagid means an enemy on Hashem and his Mashiach. They don't agree with Hashem and the message of Mashiach. Against the Jewish people. They're taking all God's blessings and they're cursing out the Jews, and the worst, they're fighting the Jews the whole time. And that itself, they destroy everything about Judaism and Torah mitzvahs, and they exile the Jews. How do we? So now we're back to the pasuk that God has to take that energy back. All the 2,000 years that Edom has been siphoning off God's kindness. And notwithstanding of them being a menaged to Hashem, Mashiach, and Am Yisrael, and putting the Jewish people in Galus, God now is saying enough's enough. That's not going to go on anymore. So what does God do when He wants to close the faucet? How do we get out of this Galus, this power that the Chitzonim were taking, siphoning off the garments of Chesed, and turn off the faucet of their flow? God goes into the attribute of netzach, of perseverance, netzach b'natzeach, to fight, to be victorious, to win. Shehu mitzad midas hadin, it's the netzach within midas hadin b'gvura. That means it's not just enough that there's a concept of boundaries, the boundaries are going to be active. And say, no, sorry, there is no place to give chesed and siphoning off to the forces of unholy. Especially those that are menaged, are fighting against the Hashem, who's Mashiach, and Am Yisrael, putting the Jewish people in Galus. Lamed neged asoynei, that God encloses himself in this mindset of netzach, to fight the enemy, to fight with him, and to be victorious over the forces of evil. The question is that the Navi asks, why did you, God, get dressed up in Edom's clothes? God enclosed himself in the enemy's mindset, in the Gevura and Din in Edom. He's saying this, like David Melch says, you want to get dirty, I'll get dirty with you. You want to be a manuvel, I'll be a manuvel with you. Levushay Nekama, he gets into the mindset of Edom, the garments of revenge. By days at this spot, when he fights against the forces of evil to cut off their life force. And they should no longer be a force of strength against the Jewish people, against godliness, against Torah. And that's what the pasuk like we showed before. By Yaz Nitzcham, that Yaz with the word Hazot, it spritzed, it sprayed. Nitzcham, the victory, but in this case, the victory is their life force. It sprayed, he got rid of their life force, which is Netzach, the blood, which is what's giving them chayis. God was menatzeach against it, but it was their netzach as long as they were siphoning up. It sprayed on God's clothing, and my clothing became disgusting. Up until this point, that was their netzach, that was their life force. They were taking from the garments of chesed, which we know that chesed and netzach on its own, netzach on its own is a strength of chesed. It's from the side of chesed netzach. But here we're talking about netzach of gvura, netzach of severity. That it's the same strength of netzach, but it's passing judgment. and saying, no more of siphoning off God and then fighting against Him, right? You're dipping your hand in your cookies and breaking the cookie jar. You're taking your energy from Hashem and fighting against Him as Mashiach and the Jewish people. Nevertheless, when God gets into the netzach of din, He takes away their netzach. That their netzach goes away, their life force goes away. And they no longer get from the strength of chesed. Let's have a few more time. I was trying to finish this page. I just want to say that what does he mean? We know that the midas are divided into three: chesed, gvur, tiferes. The extension of chesed is netzach. The extension of tiferes is yesod. That's why yesod, tiferes, das, keser. And to the left side is gvur and hoid. Means hoid is a character of gvura, of severity. That's why there's acknowledgement. There's a certain distance. Netzach is the force. So it's a force, like if chesed is a force, chesed could be a force that's a concept. Netzach is I'm committed to the chesed. So it's a force of chesed. But chesed, there's also, like we know of Sfiras Omer, all the midas have within them the midas. So the netzach on its own is a force. But put that force together with the gvura, it's a force of limitations, a force of passing judgment, a force of saying enough. You're not getting any more from siphoning off the powers of chesed. So God uses the netzach of din, means the perseverance of judgment, to take away from the perseverance of kindness, strength of kindness. What does it mean? That their netzach, the netzach that they were taking, their blood that they were taking, sprayed on the clothing of Hashem, that made it magil, made it disgusting, which is God clothing Himself in the garments of nekama, saying enough is not, nekama is revenge. To no longer, to turn off the faucet of the flow for the forces of negative and evil. But Prati says to give more detail. Like I said before, the word agalti can mean magil, but it's also rooted in the word geula, redemption. Aleph lashon giyul umius, disgusting and gross. Beis lashon geula bedus, redemption. Behind the fact that God is, so to say, soiled with the blood taken away from the nations who are siphoning off their negative ideas. We're not talking about the Gentiles that are Sidio Musa'idlam. We're talking about people that are using God's energy to be fighting against God, right? You don't have to go too far today to see around the world what that means in all different circles. So nevertheless, he says that it's one is magil mius by getting, so to say, dirty in judgment for Hashem, to get in clothing of vengeance, to stop the flow for the negative. Then Chesed's garments become redeemed. There's no longer a source for negative, and then Chesed's only positive. Before that, they were giving strength to the negative. The idea is to redeem that strength that it was given to the nations and bring it back to its source of holiness. This means God's clothing our soil. In Impure is explained somewhere else. The Pirish Mashakos that says about the part of Levi Kahos. About Yehuda, the times of Mashiach, is going to gather in the nations. The Yikas Yikas means to gather in, which is like a geula. We come up and remember Halashin Yikas, but the word Yika could also mean sharp. Halashin Kiyua, which is sharp. Shunian Charifis, Vachamitzas, vinegary and sharp. A person who makes sharp foods. The idea is to change it from Ikia, from sharp, to Yikas, to gather it in to make it sweet. That this soil sharpness, so to say, that happened from elevating the sources of impurity that we're siphoning. That at one point was giving foundation to the negative. It's like when you sweeten something that's strong. The idea is by turning around the levush, the garments, the same garments that were giving negative, you've turned it around and said, no more, it's not going to be negative. And you bring back the garments themselves to just to only being a source of holiness. It actually elevates. Like we know, every time there's a correction, you don't go back to zero. You get an elevation because of the correction. It's also part of the verse over here. He says, let me find the verse. So it says, the situation is not working. Like I have to stop the sharing and start it again. Hold on. Let's just bring these pages together again. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's bring this, share the page here again. Okay, so Yeshaya says, Pura drachti levadi, that's I think we're quoting now, right? Pura drachti levadi. So he said, Pura drachti levadi is, I trod alone means to step over, dorach. So he says, the Maamar says, let's try to make it large again. What is the point that Hashem pura derachti levadi, that he himself had to go stomp on it? Why? That Hashem himself has to do it. He can't send any other force to go and do the dirty work, so to say. Levush nekamat, to get enclosed in the clothing of revenge, to do this job of separating and no longer allowing for the forces of evil to siphon off negativity. To go fight with the forces of impurity. It's just like it was in Egypt. Like it's brought down. We say in that God, Hashem had to go redeem the Jewish people. He couldn't send any messengers. Like it says, God had to come down, not an angel, not a different kind of angel, not a shliach, a messenger, no one else. God had to go down and take the Jewish people out. So too Mashiach comes. God himself was going to have to clothe himself in garments of nekama, of revenge, of din, chametz begotten b'batzer. God, like the Rebbe's famous sikha in 1962, the Rebbe talks about this idea, chametz begotten b'batzer. God looks around and he says, no one's ready to help the Jewish people. Notwithstanding what everyone else thinks, no one's ready to help the Jewish people. I'm going to have to come do it myself. And what was the concern? If God would send an angel, the angel would get lost in all the narrative and complications and impurities. Impurities are confusion. It's be hard to figure out how to do redemption. Only God knows what redemption is like today. It's so unclear. This person says that he's horrible, the next person's horrible. Everyone says that people are trying to say the Iranians are good and this person's bad. What are you talking about? How people even doubting what's the definition of good and bad? But that's where you get lost in the narrative. Hashem himself had to do it. And so too it's going to be a Mashiach. All right. As Hashem will finish the class on Friday.